He didn't ask for attention. He didn't need a spotlight. All he wanted was to see his daughter walk across that stage like any father would. But some rooms still measure worth in silence, still draw lines you can't see until you cross them. Gabriel Rhodes knew those lines. He'd stepped over them in deserts overseas, in boardrooms back home, in moments where being calm wasn't weakness, it was survival. But nothing prepares you for being asked to move. Not because you're in the wrong seat, but because someone decided you don't belong in the front row of your own child's life. And when 6 men stood up not with words, but with presence, it wasn't about protest. It was about memory, loyalty, and the kind of dignity you can't fake. This isn't just a story about graduation. It's about the quiet cost of staying composed, and the legacy that silence leaves behind. Now, let's get started. The morning sun hadn't even burned through the Kansas haze when Major Gabriel Rhodes pulled into the parking lot behind Hutchinson Civic Arena. He parked his faded Ford Explorer between a minivan draped in streamers and a sleek black SUV. It wasn't the kind of place where people noticed the quiet cars, not on graduation day. The stadium was already swelling with families' moms holding gift bags, dads fumbling with camcorders, little kids dressed like it was Easter Sunday. The buzz was joyful, normal. But Gabriel wasn't here for the noise. He stepped out of the car in his pressed marine dress, blues no medals, just the ribbons. The shoes shined, the buttons gleamed, and the lines were perfect, not because he needed to impress anyone, but because after 22 years in uniform, he didn't know how to do halfway. Every crease was for his late wife. Every breath was for his daughter. From the glove compartment, he pulled out a photo creased at the edges, slightly faded. His wife, Janine, held their baby girl, Amira, wrapped in a tiny pink blanket. Gabriel stared at the image for a long moment, then folded it and tucked it inside his breast pocket. "I told you I wouldn't miss this," he murmured, voice barely a breath. The walk to the main entrance was slow and intentional. He moved like a man who'd carried both triumph and grief in the same hands. Every step was an anchor, not to the past but to the promise he made. Inside, the space was electric. The arena had been transformed into a sprawling auditorium, chairs stretching across the floor in precise rows, bleachers full to capacity. Banners hung from the rafters. Class of 2024. Hutchinson Unified School District. Rise and soar. Popcorn, floor wax, and perfume mingled in the air. It was the kind of smell you remember when you close your eyes years later. At the ticket checkpoint, Gabriel handed his printed confirmation to a student volunteer in a blazer too big for his frame. The boy nodded quickly and gestured toward the floor. "Front left, family section, row 3. "Thank you," Gabriel said, his voice as steady as his stride. He made his way through the crowd, ignoring the glances. Some were curious, others confused. One woman whispered to her husband. A teenager nudged their friend. The uniform always drew eyes, but the skin inside it changed the narrative. He took his seat quietly, 3rd row, left side, just like the ticket said. The chair wobbled slightly on the concrete. He adjusted it. No complaints. His focus was straight ahead, eyes locked on the stage where his daughter would walk. The band started tuning. Ushers guided latecomers. Overhead lights hummed faintly. Somewhere behind him, someone dropped their program. A toddler cried briefly, then stopped. But Gabriel didn't move, not even a glance. His whole world narrowed to the sound of his own breath and the weight of a folded photo against his heart. And then the anthem began. People stood, hands to hearts, voices raised, some on key, most not. Gabriel rose too. But he didn't place his hand on his chest. He didn't sing. He didn't need to. He was the anthem. Then, just as the final note trailed off into applause, 2 men began walking down the side aisle uniformed, but not police. Black polos, cargo pants, radios clipped to their belts, badges reading Everline Event Services. Not military, not law enforcement, just security. Gabriel noticed them instantly. The shorter one was broad-shouldered, buzz-cut, early 30s with a jaw that clenched too often. The taller one moved like a man whose mind was elsewhere chewing gum, scanning rows, uninterested. They weren't searching generally, they were zeroing in. On him. Gabriel didn't shift, didn't flinch. He kept his hands on his thighs, palms relaxed. He had survived worse than awkward stares and misjudged authority. But something in their walk too direct, too assured told him this wasn't routine. The shorter one leaned in, voice low. "Sir, we're gonna need you to come with us." Gabriel turned his head slowly. "Is there a problem?" The tall one answered. "This section's reserved for the immediate family." Gabriel reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the folded ticket, and handed it over. "Row 3, family seating. Confirmed." The man barely glanced at it. "We were told it's full." Gabriel stayed still. "It was full when I sat down too." "You want to tell me who gave that order?" The taller one hesitated. "Look, man, we've got seats in the back. Let's not turn this into anything." Gabriel's voice dropped, not with menace, but with conviction. "I drove 600 miles to watch my daughter graduate. I'll be sitting right here." People nearby began to notice. A few heads turned. A woman 2 rows over leaned toward her husband. A camera phone subtly tilted. The shorter guard's posture stiffened. "Sir, last chance." Gabriel didn't blink. "You can ask all day. I'm not moving." The tall one shifted again. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back." That phrase? It wasn't about logistics. It was about belonging, about old scripts whispered in boardrooms, waiting rooms, and classrooms. About a lifetime of being told you're not quite welcome here, even when you follow every rule. Gabriel didn't speak. He didn't have to. Stillness was a language of its own. But the air has changed now. The kind of shift you feel before a storm, when the wind stills and people pretend they don't notice, but they do. And this was only the beginning. Gabriel didn't move. Not when the taller guard shifted from one foot to the other. Not when the buzz of the crowd grew restless. Not even when the shorter one's voice grew tighter, his tone clipped with impatience masked as authority. "Sir, we've asked politely. Now we're instructing you, please move to the back." Gabriel turned his head slowly. "Instructing?" he repeated, calm and deliberate. "You don't outrank me, son." The taller one, his badge, red holder, grimaced and looked over his shoulder, maybe hoping someone would bail him out. But all he saw were parents watching, pretending not to. It wasn't a fight yet. But it was a fuse, and it was burning. The shorter one, Lentz, wasn't as cautious. He leaned down, lowering his voice again. "Look, you can sit anywhere else in this arena. This section is just for real family." That word, real. Gabriel's hand stayed in place, but the edges of his fingers curled ever so slightly against his knees. He'd fought for a country that taught him to carry himself with pride, but it never guaranteed it would return the gesture. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he said, steady as stone. Lentz stood upright, frustrated now. "Suit yourself." But he didn't walk away. He lingered, hovered, like a shadow that didn't belong to the light. And Gabriel understood something right then, not about the guards, but about what this moment truly was. It wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about overbooking. It was about presence. About a black man in uniform sitting too close to the front. He'd seen it before. Not always in words. Not always in actions. Sometimes in glances. Sometimes in the subtle orchestration of discomfort, meant to make people like him choose silence. Choose distance. Choose the back. But Gabriel had chosen this chair for a reason. Not just because it was assigned to him, but because a mirror would scan that crowd looking for one face, and he wasn't going to let that girl see an empty seat. Behind him, a soft voice cut through the static. An older woman, white hair. Floral scarf leaned ever so slightly in his direction. "Don't you let them move you," she whispered, barely audible. Gabriel didn't look at her. He just nodded, his chin dipping once. He hadn't come to be seen. He came to see. But the problem was, people were watching now. The standoff wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. The kind of quiet that carries weight. Tension you feel in your stomach before you name it. And up on the stage, the ceremony was pressing forward. School board members adjusted microphones. A choir teacher gestured to students. The first row of graduates lined up, caps and gowns swaying nervously as they moved. Amira was somewhere in the second group. Gabriel hadn't spotted her yet, but he felt her, like a heartbeat across the room. She didn't know what was happening. Not yet. And God willing, she wouldn't have to. But the guards hadn't left. If anything, they grew more agitated with each minute he refused to budge. Holder stepped closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," Gabriel said, barely above a whisper. "You already made it hard the moment you decided I didn't belong." Holder flinched just slightly but said nothing. Lentz, however, was not done. "You think this uniform means something," he muttered, voice low and bitter. "You think that seat makes you special?" Gabriel didn't rise, didn't engage. He'd been through Kandahar, Helmand, Fallujah. He'd seen men break down in ways no one ever writes about. He'd stood in places where silence saved lives. But here, in a stadium built for cheering, this was a different kind of battlefield. The kind where the weapons are invisible. Still, he said nothing, and that silence made Lentz uneasy. He turned, scanning the crowd. A few students had stopped chatting. A parent near the aisle raised a phone, maybe filming, maybe not. Then something shifted. Far across the arena, a man stood, clean-shaven, stone-faced, tan jacket, jeans, military bearing beneath civilian fabric. He crossed his arms and locked eyes on the scene from 50 feet away. No words, just presence. Then another man stood, different sections, older, heavier, with a cane but the same stillness, the same focus. Then a third, and a fourth. All scattered, no formation. But it was clear now, this wasn't a coincidence. Gabriel didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He knew that posture, that stillness, that watchfulness born from fire. They were his men. Brothers forged in sand and silence. Men who didn't need orders to act. And yet, he remained seated. Because this wasn't about show, it was about principle. And across the arena, just out of view, Amira Rhodes adjusted her graduation cap. She was in the lineup now. She hadn't seen her father yet, but she was trying. She always did. Since her mother passed away, Gabriel had been both anchor and sail. The quiet at the dinner table, the steady hand through heartbreak, the man who never had the right words, but always the right presence. He hadn't told her much about the war, just fragments, names she'd never met, places she couldn't pronounce. A scar, he claimed, was from tripping over bad choices. But she knew. She always knew. And now something told her deep in her chest that something wasn't right. She peeked around a classmate, her eyes scanning the crowd. Where is he? Where's Dad? Back in the audience, Lentz had finally dropped his mask. His voice, barely controlled, carried just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You can either move or be escorted, your choice." And that's when Gabriel finally looked up only, not at Lentz. He looked toward the back corner of the arena, to where a man stood with arms crossed, unmoved. Marcus Kane, the man he'd carried through sniper fire in 2010, the one who'd flatlined twice in the evac chopper and came back swinging. Gabriel nodded once. Kane didn't return the nod. He just turned slightly and looked down at another man beside him. Then another stood. Then another. 5 now. 6. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Gabriel had never been alone. Not really. Not then. Not now. Lentz glanced around, noticing too late that the air had thickened, that people were no longer glancing, they were staring. And somewhere in the hallway behind the stage, Amira finally spotted her father, seated, still, surrounded. And though she didn't yet know what had happened, she knew exactly what it meant. Marcus Kane didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave his arms or demand anything. He simply stepped into the aisle, slow and deliberate, like the space around him had already agreed to move. His presence alone was enough to draw every eye from the graduates to the floor. Teachers stiffened. A man in a blazer near the stage put a hand on his earpiece, and started whispering frantically. But Marcus kept walking head high, steps calm. He didn't look angry, he looked certain. Lentz turned toward him. "Sir, please return to your seat. This doesn't concern." Marcus cut him off with a stare that didn't blink. "I asked a question," he said. His voice was soft, but it landed with weight. "Is there a reason this man is being harassed in front of his daughter's graduation?" Lentz opened his mouth, closed it again. Gabriel remained seated. Kane didn't move closer. He didn't need to. From across the room, 4 more stood. They weren't military anymore, not officially. But some things never leave you. Like posture. Like silence. Like knowing exactly when to stand. They took different spots near exits, along the side walls, behind camera setups. They didn't nod at each other, didn't exchange a single word, but the room changed around them. Lentz's eyes bounced from face to face. "What is this?" he muttered. The tall one, Holder, stepped back. "I think maybe we let this one go." "No," Lentz snapped under his breath. "They're trying to play us." "They're not playing anything," a voice said from the crowd. It came from the 5th man, who stood tall, black, with a silver beard and a dark suit that looked borrowed from a funeral. He didn't move toward the conflict, just stood rooted, watching, radiating presence. Kane nodded toward him once. Lentz looked around, then leaned in toward Gabriel again. "You got some kind of backup planned here?" Gabriel didn't blink. "You think this is about backup? You got a whole squad out here like this is war," Lentz whispered sharply. "That's not how things work. This is a school." Gabriel slowly turned to face him, and for the first time, his voice hardened. "Don't you ever mistake dignity for weakness," he said. "Not in front of my daughter." And something about the way he said daughter, not loud, not aggressive, cut through Lentz like ice. Up on the stage, the principal was whispering frantically to someone near the podium. An assistant scurried off to the side with a radio. Parents started murmuring. The crowd knew something was happening now, and not just tension, not just awkwardness. This was a reckoning. Amira could feel it from the wings. She was now one group away from the stage. Her name would be called in minutes, but her eyes never left her father. She could see the 2 men standing too close. She could see the 6 men scattered across the crowd like shadows anchoring the moment. She didn't know all their names, but she recognized their purpose. And that was enough. She glanced at a friend next to her, who whispered, "Is that your dad?" Amira didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because suddenly, another man stood. This time, from the far right side of the Areneby, the doors near the media platform. He wore no uniform, no tie, just jeans and a dark flannel shirt. His posture, though, gave him away. You could always tell a soldier who'd seen real war. The room grew quieter, not silent, but tense in a way that words couldn't quite touch. Lentz looked around and finally said the words that broke whatever illusion he had of control. "You think wearing that uniform makes you better than everyone else?" The words spilled out faster than his mouth could catch. "This ain't your base, man. You're just another parent here." There it was. The line. The one that didn't get shouted, but hung in the air like a knife waiting to drop. Gabriel inhaled just once, not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to center himself. The room waited for his answer. But he didn't speak. Because he didn't have to. Marcus Kane stepped forward again. This time, not slow, not with caution, but with decision. He moved down the aisle, locking eyes on Lentz the entire way. When he reached the edge of Gabriel's row, he didn't point, didn't raise a hand. He just said, "You're 1 inch away from disgrace." Lentz bristled. "Back off." But Marcus leaned slightly in, lowering his voice. "Touch him again, and I swear your badge won't be the only thing you lose." That's when the final seal stood. He had been sitting quietly near the upper bleachers by himself, unnoticed, until now. Now he stood like a wall in a suit. And the crowd? They stopped pretending not to watch. Dozens of eyes, phones out, parents nudging each other, students pointing, whispering. A moment ago, this was about a man and a chair. Now it was about something far bigger. The principal rushed to the floor, whispering sharply into Lentz's ear. Her face was pale. Her body language said it all. "Stop this now." Lentz looked around again. He was cornered not by force, not by shouting, but by dignity, by history, by the truth that 6 men in silence could carry more authority than any threat ever could. He stepped back. Just one step. Then another. He mumbled something into his radio. Holder followed, eyes downcast, chewing his lip. And just like that, the moment passed. But no one in that room would ever forget it. Gabriel didn't stand, didn't smirk, didn't speak. He simply turned his head toward the stage, just in time to see the final group lining up for names to be called. Backstage, Amira adjusted the collar of her gown. Her hands were shaking not from fear, but from something deeper. A fire she hadn't known she carried until now. A girl nearby asked again, "That really your dad?" Amira nodded. "That's my father." The next name was called. Then another. She was 2 people away. "One." The announcer paused, glanced at a card, then spoke slower, fuller, with a weight that said she understood. Amira Elise Rhodes. And in that beat of silence before the crowd erupted, there was stillness. Gabriel sat forward slightly. 6 men stood tall across the arena, and Amira walked head high, chin steady, feet grounded. The applause wasn't loudest for her. It was deepest, resonant, rhythmic, like a heartbeat across generations, like the sound of legacy claiming its place. And when Amira reached for her diploma, she didn't look to the principal, or the camera, or the crowd. She looked to the 3rd row, left side, where her father sat, still, grounded, unmoved. And Gabriel, who had said so little, gave her the smallest smile. But it held the weight of everything. As Amira stepped off the stage, the arena slowly remembered how to breathe. People clapped again, some louder now, some with tears they couldn't quite explain. A woman in the back row stood up and started clapping long after the others had sat down. A father hugged his son a little tighter. A student whispered to her mother, "Did you see what just happened?" But Gabriel, he remained still. Not because he didn't feel anything, but because what he felt was too big for motion, too deep for celebration. He had made it, not to a chair, not through a confrontation, but through the kind of storm that didn't come with thunder but with silence, with implication, with the pressure to shrink. And he hadn't. He had stayed. He had witnessed his daughter walk. And that, more than anything, was the victory. The 6 men who stood guard from the crowd didn't move either. They stood until the next 5 names were called. Until the principal caught their eyes, gave the smallest respectful nod, and the tension began to dissolve into memory. Marcus Kane finally sat down. Then the man in the flannel. Then the silver-bearded soldier. One by one, like a tide receding after standing firm against a storm. Gabriel didn't acknowledge them, not publicly, but when his eyes met Marcus's across the rows, he gave a single nod. It wasn't gratitude. It was understanding. Because men like them didn't thank each other with words. They thanked each other by showing up. Behind the stage, Amira waited to exit with the other graduates, but her world felt suspended. She didn't feel 18 anymore. She didn't feel like the girl who walked in that morning worrying if her cap was crooked. She felt something else now. She had watched her father be challenged publicly, unfairly, and she had watched him hold his ground without lifting a hand, without raising a voice. And she had seen what it meant to be respected by those who knew the cost of silence. She had heard stories always in Pisa about dusty deserts and chopper rides and names scratched into dog tags, but nothing had taught her more about her father than watching him say everything without saying anything. When the last student exited and caps flew into the air like 1,000 red and white birds, the noise returned. Shouts, laughter, cameras flashing, music blaring from the speakers overhead. But Gabriel didn't rush to meet the crowd. He sat a moment longer, alone in a now empty row, letting it settle, letting himself feel it, not just the pride but the ache beneath it, the weight of years, the memory of Janine's voice telling him, "You better not miss this day, Gabe." He could almost hear her laughing. Then he stood. Outside the arena, the Kansas sun had shifted low across the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Students grouped together near cars, waving signs, taking selfies, tossing caps a second and third time. Someone passed out cupcakes. A grandmother wept openly into a tissue. Gabriel moved through the crowd like a lighthouse in motion. People parted instinctively. He didn't look for Amira. He didn't have to. He knew she'd find him. And she did. Near the flagpole, away from the loudest clumps of students, she stood in her gown, cap off, diploma folder in one hand, and her phone in the other. When she saw him, she didn't wave. She didn't run. She just walked steady, slow, like someone approaching something sacred. They met halfway. Amira spoke first. "You okay?" Gabriel nodded. "You?" She hesitated. "They tried to move you." "I know." Her jaw tensed. "I was going to walk off that stage." He raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "I was 2 seconds away from dropping my diploma and yelling across the gym." Gabriel didn't smile. He placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "And that's why you didn't." She looked up at him. "Because you knew I could handle it," he continued. "And because you handled your moment like a woman." She swallowed hard. "Who were those guys?" she asked. "The ones who stood?" Gabriel turned slightly, glancing back toward the arena entrance. The 6 men were still nearby, spread out now, blending into the crowd, talking softly, keeping their eyes on him, on her, on everything. "They're men I bled with," he said. "Men who know what loyalty means. Men who don't forget." Amira exhaled. "That was powerful." "It was necessary," Gabriel said. "Sometimes silence is louder than shouting, and sometimes standing up without speaking says more than 1,000 words." They stood there for a moment, not talking. The world didn't feel loud anymore. Then Amira said, "You're gonna have to tell me those stories one day." Gabriel smiled finally, a real one. "Some of them," he said. "You're old enough now." Across the parking lot, Marcus Kane gave a slight raise of the hand. Not a wave, not a salute, just a quiet gesture of respect. Amira returned it without hesitation. Then Gabriel reached into his jacket, pulled out the old photo, handed it to her. She looked at it, Janine holding baby Amira, years and lifetimes ago. "She would have screamed the loudest today," Amira whispered. "She would have made you retake every photo until your smile looked just right," Gabriel replied. And Amira laughed through a tear she didn't try to hide. They walked to the car in silence. No words needed. But one more question tugged at her as they got in. She turned to him before he started the ignition. "Why didn't you say anything to them?" Gabriel looked over, his hand resting on the wheel. "Because I don't have to stand up for who I am, and I don't need to raise my voice to be heard." She nodded slowly. "You know how many times in my life," he said, "I've had to choose between letting something slide or blowing it up." She didn't answer. That moment today? What did those men try to do? It wasn't new, but how we respond, that's what defines us. Amira stared out the window, then turned back. "But they disrespected you, in front of everyone." "Yes," Gabriel said, "and everyone saw it, but they also saw the truth." He gestured gently toward the arena behind them. "They saw 6 men who had every reason to be somewhere else stand up, not because I asked, because they knew what that moment meant." Amira sat with that. And then he said one last thing before pulling away. "Life will hand you 100 chances to react with anger. And sometimes anger's justified. But most times, silence cuts deeper. Dignity sticks longer. That's what people remember." And as the car pulled out into the dusky light, Amira leaned her head against the window. Not tired, just still. Inside her, something had settled into place. Something she hadn't had a name for until now. And when she looked at her father again, she didn't see a man in uniform. She saw a man who had nothing left to prove, because he already was everything the world needed to witness. The sun was beginning to settle into the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the highway as Gabriel and Amira drove in silence. The Ford Explorer hummed steadily, old but dependable, a car built for long trips and longer memories. Neither of them spoke for a while. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't heavy. It was sacred. At one red light, Amira reached into her graduation folder and ran her fingers across the raised gold lettering. Hutchinson Unified School District Class of 2024. She smiled. Then I looked over. Do you ever wish you had said something? Back there? Gabriel didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the road. Then he said, no. Why not? He tapped the steering wheel once, thought carefully. Because when you know who you are, he said, you don't need to announce it. Amira nodded slowly, letting that settle. I've had a lot of moments in my life where people tried to move me, he continued. From rooms, from roles, from decisions, sometimes physically, most times subtly. But the goal's always the same. Make you smaller, make you quieter, make you question your right to take up space. Amira looked out her window again. The fields of Kansas blurred past. So what did you do? Gabriel smiled slightly. I sat. Amira didn't say anything, but her chest filled. With pride, with understanding, with a kind of adult clarity that settles on you when childhood finally lets go. They drove on. The GPS buzzed softly in the background, but neither needed it. Eventually, they pulled off the freeway into a quiet neighborhood where Janine used to drive Amira to weekend recitals. The streets hadn't changed. Gabriel pointed out a tree she once climbed when she was 8. A corner store that no longer existed. A stop sign still leaning slightly from a winter storm 2 years ago. Every detail was still alive in him. They pulled into a small diner parking lot. Waffle House, per Amira's request. The neon sign buzzed overhead like it always had. They sat in a booth by the window. Gabriel ordered coffee. Amira got waffles with extra syrup and a side of hash browns. She hadn't eaten since early morning. Halfway through her meal, she looked up. You ever going to tell me what happened in Syria? Gabriel paused, then said, no. Amira's face fell just a little. But I'll tell you what happened after, he added. She looked up again. There was a day, he said, when I pulled a man out of a burning vehicle. Fire was everywhere. We were pinned down, and I had a choice, save him or save myself. Her eyes widened. I saved him, Gabriel said. Didn't think about it, didn't weigh the odds. I just moved, because that's what we do when we lead. We don't ask if it's fair. We don't ask if it's smart. We just act on what's right. He stirred his coffee gently. Afterward, he continued, that man looked at me and said nothing. He didn't cry. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded. And in that nod, everything was understood. Amira exhaled. Like today? Gabriel nodded. Exactly like today. They finished their meal quietly. Outside, the parking lot had emptied. A warm dusk breeze passed through, carrying the scent of fried batter and gasoline. Gabriel opened the car door for her. Amira slid in, then looked back at the diner. She spotted something. One of the Mentha's silver-bearded veterans stood near the curb, arms crossed, speaking softly on a phone. He wasn't there for recognition. He wasn't there for follow-up. He was just there. Still watching. Still present. She nudged her father. He's still here. Gabriel looked, then nodded once. They never really leave, he said. Back on the road, the last stretch of the sky turned indigo. Fields gave way to streetlights. Laughter spilled from a house party on the corner. A child on a bicycle waved at their car as it passed. Life, uninterrupted. But for Amira, something had changed. It wasn't just about graduation anymore. It wasn't even about injustice. It was about weight, the kind you carry in silence, the kind you inherit not through blood, but through example. When they pulled into their driveway, Gabriel didn't rush inside. He turned off the engine but left the keys in the ignition. Amira sat still for a moment. Then she asked quietly, Dad, are you proud of me? Gabriel turned to her, slowly. I've always been proud of you, he said. But today, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph again. Janine holding a baby Amira. I carried this through combat zones, funerals, and long, lonely nights. I carried it today because I knew what kind of woman you'd become. He handed it to her. I don't need medals, Amira. I don't need speeches. I just needed to see you walk that stage with your head up, your spine straight, and your heart intact. Amira blinked back tears. You did that, he whispered. And you didn't let what happened to me take that moment from you. She smiled. I wanted to. I wanted to scream. I know, he said, but instead, you stood in your own dignity. He opened the door and stepped out. She followed. As they walked up the porch steps, Amira paused. Do you think people will forget what happened today? Gabriel looked at the stars above them. No. Why not? Because it wasn't dramatic, he said. It was real. He turned the key and opened the door to their home. And real never disappears. In a world that often asks us to prove our worth, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply remain grounded in who we are. Gabriel didn't fight back with noise, he stood firm with presence. And in doing so, he reminded us that real strength doesn't need a stage, it just needs truth. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe and share what resonated most with you in the comments. We'd love to hear your voice. Some people shout to be seen, others just sit in silence and are never forgotten. Stay tuned.